Buddy said, my name is Jordan Maroon, and I'm the small group coordinator and head of Young Professionals Ministry for Needles Eye. And it's my privilege today to introduce you to our speaker, Justin Earley. Justin is a native Richmonder. He's married to Lauren. They have 3 sons and a 4th on the way. So God bless them. They are very involved at Third Church, and Justin and I, a long time ago, went to Midlothian High School together. So we go back a little ways. After Justin attended the University of Virginia, he moved to Shanghai. And he spent a few years doing nonprofit work and working as a missionary. And one day, he told me this story, one day on the streets of Shanghai, he had this really transformative experience where he saw simultaneously 4 illegal things happening right out in the open. Very bluntly, very blatantly. 4 illegal things: a drug dealer, a black marketer, a brothel, and an old lady protesting. Which of the 4 do you think was arrested that day? This old lady with her simple sign that said, "The judicial system is broken and the people in the countryside are being oppressed." And this moment kind of stuck in Justin's head and got him thinking long and hard about how the institutions of law and business and economics shape our daily lives. And it actually led him to leaving sort of traditional ministry in China and moving back to the States to be a missionary through law and business. So he came back to the States, he got a law degree from Georgetown University, and then he came back to Richmond to work for McGuire Woods as a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, working closely with their Chinese investors. And Justin is writing a book to be published through InterVarsity Press in February of 2019 entitled The Common Rule, and he'll be speaking to us today about some of the ideas and contents of that book. And he runs a website that I would highly commend to you of the same name, thecommonrule.org, thecommonrule.org. And I just really appreciate Justin, and I'm glad that he's speaking to us today because he's an incredibly thoughtful person. He thinks deeply and wisely about his personal life, about his faith, about his work, about his family life, about the church, about community. And I'm always impressed and a little bit jealous when I hear Justin speak because he has a precision to his thoughts that I think you will recognize very quickly and really appreciate. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Justin Earley.
Thank you all. It's an honor to be introduced by Jordan. I had a high respect for him when I sat behind him in English class. I think it was in 10th grade, and I still have a high respect for him now. Well, let me get right to it. On August 23rd of last year, if you were in and around Houston, Texas, and you turned on the radios, you would have heard a constant stream of evacuation orders. A storm was coming. You might remember it was Hurricane Harvey. And everyone was told to get out. And I remember on the internet seeing pictures the next morning of a long line of cars stacked up on the interstate, fleeing the city. And as I continued to browse, I saw a photograph that stopped me in my tracks and gave me chills. It was the same thing. It was a long line of trucks, but each one had a boat. And as I looked at the picture and noticed the signs in the picture, I slowly realized, as did the rest of the internet, that these trucks were headed into Houston. On hearing of the danger, they ran to it. And on hearing that the storm was coming, they drove into it. So I begin this way because I believe that we are actually in a kind of cultural storm. And the storm is this. You and I, and our coworkers and our neighbors, are absolutely overwhelmed by our busyness. Now, when I talk about the crisis of busyness today, I am not talking about having a lot to do. Studies actually show that moving from less to do to more to do is often a cause of happiness. Moving from less to do to more to do is often within bounds a cause of productivity. So I'm not just talking about having a lot to do. What I am talking about is the kind of frenetic busyness that seems to be a thinly veiled search for limitlessness. A sort of hungry appetite to do more and more and more, combined with an inability to ever say no. It was like when I was talking to a lawyer a couple weeks back, and I heard them say, "I'm trying to convince myself that I don't need sleep." And they were smiling, but I didn't believe it. This is the kind of busyness that Tim Kreider, in an excellent New York Times op-ed called The Busy Trap, says that, quote, serves as a hedge against emptiness. He writes, obviously your life cannot possibly be silly or trivial or meaningless if you are so busy, so completely booked, and in demand every hour of the day. So what I am talking about is the kind of pursuit of limitlessness that smacks of a meaninglessness. And I would say to you, this is not just a storm in our current culture of America. I would actually say it is so endemic and deep that it's more like a climate that is perfectly situated to produce the storms of anxiety, of overcrowded schedules, and the depression and alcohol abuse that all comes with it. This is a storm, and I begin with this image of the trucks because I want to ask us a question today. I want to ask us, when we look out and see a storm, are we the kinds of followers of Jesus who head for the hills, or are we the kind who walk into the storm? So I want to try to go about this in 3 ways today. First, I just want to try to convince you that there is a modern problem. And I want to specifically try to convince you that the problem of limitlessness that I'm talking about is not just a problem of worldview. It is. But it is also more even a problem of lived habit, a way of acting that despite what we say about what we believe, a lived way of practice. And I want to argue that our habits are more formative than what we say when it comes to our schedules. Second, I want to introduce you to an ancient example of a man who I believe was able to unite worldview and habit in a way that enabled his community in his time to not just weather the storm that they were facing, but to be the kind of church that walked into the storm. So I want to give you an example of how 1,500 years ago somebody did this well. And then third, finally, I want to make it as practical as I can and introduce you to a few daily and weekly habits that I am writing about in the book that I'm working on called The Common Rule, and suggest that we need to adopt practices that actually incarnate our worldview into daily lived life, not as a way of weathering the storm simply for the sake of saving ourselves, but as a way of being like those trucks, like the Savior we proclaim, as a way of walking into the storm. So first, let me try to convince you that we actually do have a modern storm. And to do that, I'm going to need to tell you a story. Fortunately, Jordan already told you part of it, so I can skip the biographical part. You know, I was a missionary in China. I came back because of this interesting encounter with a protester, and I would have told you at the time, and I would stand and still tell you now, that when I came back to Georgetown Law School to become a corporate lawyer, I had a Christian mission. I really did. Notwithstanding that, the habits of my life at the time looked like what every other crazy top law student looked like. Lots of calendar alerts, phone always dinging and binging. My schedule was overcrowded. I tried to do everything. That's the way you get a good resume. That's the way you get a good job. I was doing as much as I could because that's what I thought top law students did, and that's how I thought young lawyers were successful. I would say now the house of my life, so to speak, was decorated with all kinds of Christian content, but the architecture, the habit and schedule it was built up of, was just the same as everybody else's. And it was working fine until it wasn't. So one night, a few months after moving to Richmond, a few months after having my second son, a few months after passing the bar and starting a new job, a lot of things were colliding. I found myself lying in bed, perfectly normal, until I suddenly snapped awake in a feeling of existential panic. And I had no idea what was happening to me. I know now the words for it. It's called a panic attack, and some of you in the room have probably experienced it. But then I was just shaking, I was nervous, I was scared, and over what? I had no idea. It was so terrifying that by the second night when I wasn't sleeping and it was continually happening, I ended up in the emergency room where, in one of the most anticlimactic moments of my life, a doctor looked at me and said, well, you have clinical anxiety. And I thought, I even told him at the time, you don't understand. I am low stress. I am high capacity. Let me get you my resume. Let me show you what I can do. But it all faded because what did it amount to? Me, nervous, wreck in an emergency room. And he sent me home with a bottle of sleeping pills. And this inaugurated what is now the darkest storm of my life. So I did not know then, I know now that I react very poorly to those sleeping pills. All the things you read on the back were true of me. The hallucinogenic nightmares, the suicidal thoughts. My emotional life cratered. I remember one night, a couple weeks in, I was standing in the kitchen and my wife handed me some dishes to put away. And I took them and I looked at her and I said to her, honestly, I do not know where these go. I was so thin in my mind and in my emotional life, that I did not know how to put the dishes away. You can imagine I was worried about keeping my job. You can imagine I was worried about whether I could continue to be a father and a husband. And for a long stretch of nights during that time, I needed either medication or alcohol to fall asleep. It's as bad as it sounded. Now, mental illness and bouts with it like this are extraordinarily complicated. So I do not intend to oversimplify when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. But I will tell you that in hindsight, with the clarity of retrospect, I now see that one of the biggest things that was going on for me was my heart and my body had finally become converted to the anxiety and the busyness that my habits and my routines worshipped. I would say this climate of the busy storm sunk in, not because of any argument that anybody told me, but because of a feel, an ethos, a way of living that finally sunk down. And I remember another night, this is a much better memory, sitting with two of my best friends at a bar, this time only having one drink, and there was a piece of paper on the table where we had sketched out a program of habits that my wife and my best friends had decided to keep me accountable to. They were habits designed to try to get my heart to believe again the peace that my head did profess, but my heart seemed to refuse. And I'm standing here now, thank God, and praise Him, a totally different man. That was the beginning of my life being transformed by what I now know is fairly ordinary spiritual disciplines. But I had no idea the extent to which your ordinary, regular, everyday life and the worship that is bound up there, and I'll talk about that in a second, how much that actually forms your heart and forms who you are. As it turns out, you are much more a product of your ordinary life than you are your greatest fears or your greatest hopes. And that's the thing. My story might be personal. It is not unusual. And that is both sad and interesting. Many people I now know that now that I talk about this have incredibly similar experiences. And many of us have this sense of darkness that something is guiding our lives and it's not us. So my story is personal, but it's not unusual. Let me try to give you an argument, theologically and neurologically, about why I keep saying things like habits form us. Both of them very briefly. Theologically. May 21st, 2005, American novelist named David Foster Wallace gave an instantly famous graduation address at Kenyon College. It was called This Is Water, and it started with this story. There's two young fish swimming along the ocean one day, and an older fish swim by. And he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two fish swim on for a while, until one of them turns to the other and says, "What is water?" And the point, as David Foster Wallace made so well, is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, and important realities are precisely the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about. And here was what I would say, the ubiquitous reality is that our way of living and the habits that are bound up in it is a way of worship. It is dangerously possible to worship idols without ever consciously assenting to them. America would like you to think that we are a land of the free, we are a neutral place, we are a secular place, and you can swim in the waters of America and go to your worship service on Sunday, and that is where you worship, and the other days, you're just neutral. You're free, you're secular. Don't believe it. Don't believe it for a minute. You were made to worship every minute of every day, all of life. To live at all is worship, including our most ordinary of habits. And David Foster Wallace, actually, to my knowledge, he's not a Christian, but he makes this point later in the same speech. He says that you cannot not worship. Your only choice is what? It's the same point our pastors are trying to make nearly every other Sunday. As the psalmist says, those who make and trust in idols will become like them. Okay, so the theological argument is that worship is all the time, it's bound up in our habits, and we become like the idols we worship were formed. Neurologically, it's interesting, we now know more about the brain that actually backs up this theology. So the writer Charles Duhigg wrote an excellent book called The Power of Habit, where he talks about the fact that when a habit is formed, the brain stops fully participating in the decision making. All right? So habit activity in the brain happens in the deepest part of the brain, called the basal ganglia. And this is how you and I can leave the office and arrive in our driveways in our car, not ever thinking about a single turn that we made, because we're thinking over some sticky work problem or some relational issue. This is good for us because we can put our brains to better use. This is very dangerous because when it is a bad habit, when it is, let's say, an addictive pattern of thought, or a idolatrous pattern of thought, an envious pattern of thought, a needlessly self-critical pattern of thought, well, all the work that we've done in our education and our worldview training is almost handicapped because our brains aren't working on it. And this is the difference between what we talk about when we talk about education, which is what we learn, what we're taught, what we know, and when we talk about formation, which is what we practice, what we do, the things that are caught, not taught. And I would suggest to you that to be followers of Jesus, we need both. We need both big time. Let me put these together in a concrete example. Show you how a man can simultaneously reject these idols and yet bow the knee of habit to them. This man is me. Let me tell you about my morning routine pre my anxiety crash, okay? Habit 1, wake up short on sleep because I never go to bed on time. What's the liturgy of the habit? Well, I'm limitless. I can push my body to the limit. I'm a God. I can do whatever I need to do. Habit 2, look at work emails first thing before getting out of bed. Liturgy of the habit. I can miss a time reading my Bible, but I cannot miss a quick response. If I'm not well regarded in my office, then what am I worth after all? Habit 3, get breakfast on the go while everybody else in my house scrambles to get somewhere late. At the office, eat at my desk. What's the liturgy of worship? Well, to be too busy is not only normal, but maybe even desirable. Like, I'm important if people want my time, so I've got to keep sprinting if I want to feel important. One last one, keep alerts on my phone and computer on and Insight while I work all the time. What's the liturgy going on? Well, the most recent thing is the most important thing. The most urgent thing is the most relevant thing. And the way to love my neighbors and coworkers and clients is not to do good, focused, creative, thorough work. No, it's to stay updated. Make the quickest response to the most recent person who wants your attention. So let's stop there. Not even 10 a.m. And precisely by not having a program of habit formation, I am being rigorously formed in the cultural waters of instantness, of busyness, of limitlessness, of omniscience, of omnipresence. No wonder my heart and my body rebelled. No wonder we are seeing record numbers of people who are anxious, depressed, struggling with substance abuse, suicidal thoughts. This climate that we live in is perfectly situated to produce the storms that are now so common. And I don't want us to hear this just as, okay, let's get it together because it feels better to not be like this. That's a real thing, but what I want you to see is what our neighbors, what our colleagues are experiencing. They, like us, have lives that are completely disordered by modern American habits. But perhaps they, unlike us, also have worldviews that are completely deconstructed into ideas that the world is meaninglessness, and so they oscillate between their despair and their coping, and I want to ask us, would we blame them? Or would we go to them? Would we try to walk into that storm? Let me give you an example from the 5th century of someone who I think walked into the storm. So during the 5th century, Rome is falling. The barbarians have sacked it, and their world is falling to the chaos of the Vandals. It is a climate of despair and decline, and nobody knows what to do. Now, across the Mediterranean, in what is modern-day Algeria, is a North African. And he is really well educated, and he's an incredible orator, which made him a kind of celebrity of the day. He loved alcohol. He loved women. In fact, before he converted and became a monk, he wrote the famous prayer, "Lord, give me chastity, just not yet." This is, of course, St. Augustine of Hippo, who finds himself the bishop of a church during the collapse of Rome. And he's running a monastery in the middle of a fallen kingdom, and he's asking a really important question. 2 really important questions, actually. 1, how is it that believers can rebuild the city of God for cultural renewal when a kingdom is falling? You see, he's at the biggest sort of worldview cultural renewal question. He is writing about it in his magnum opus, The City of God. And you know what he's writing at the same time? He's writing this thing called a rule of life for his monastery, which is a set of ordinary, regular habits. Now, why would he do these things at the same time? Well, Augustine saw that we cannot be the kind of people that build the city of God without becoming the kind of people who love God and neighbor by being formed through everyday practice. So he is writing things so specific in his rule of life, such as be assiduous in prayer at the hours and times appointed. A schedule for prayer, you see. He says, quote, when you go outside the monastery, walk in pairs. And when you get to where you're going, stay together. It's little habits of community. Books are to be checked out of the library at the fixed hour each day. Little organized ways of study. Look, Augustine, as one writer put it, was trying to cultivate virtues through practices that would reshape existence in light of what Christians call grace. So I want to step back for a moment and just look at what Augustine was doing and say, he was showing that you can have a compelling vision to bring cultural renewal, but if you wanted to actually walk into the storm, you would need to have a set of daily practices to become the kind of people who could do that. And why would you do that? Well, right at the top of his little rule of life says, the purpose is to love God and neighbor. That's what all of this is for. It's a way of walking into the storm with love. Now, I would suggest to you that we in our time need something similar. That we need a thick idea of practice to go along with what I think we are already pretty good at, and that is thick ideas of worldview. So I want to introduce you to 4 habits here, and I want to introduce you to 2 daily ones and 2 weekly ones. And each of these are coming from the argument that we are formed by our daily practices. Here are 4 ways I think we need to be counter-formational in the storm that is trying to form us into chaos. Daily habit 1, scripture before phone. All right? So if habits are worship, we are trying to zoom in here on the moment of waking and say, what are we being formed in as we wake up? Are we being formed in the love of God as revealed to us in the Psalms? Or are we being formed in the utter chaos that arrives to our heart's doorsteps through these? It might be the morning news, right? These angsty stories of cultural decline that are designed to get you so mad that you stew on them all day and you come back for more in the evening news. Or would we counter that maybe with an epistle, which is designed to give us peace about the providence of God through history? Or maybe it's social media, right? We open our eyes to these stories of what everybody else is doing, how they're traveling, how they're eating so well, how their kids are always behaved. And look, I use social media, so don't get me wrong. But if we want to use it well, we've got to realize that it is not neutral, it is formative. And beginning our day, putting our half-awake minds right in its skewed stories, is a way of being trained in anxiety and envy. I would suggest to you, think about the habit of looking at God's love before you look at the phone. Daily habit 2, unsurprisingly still about your phone. Turn it off for 1 hour a day. So here we're trying to resist absence and embrace presence as a way of formation, okay? Now, if you want to understand this, you got to think about presence being at the heart of all things, okay? The presence is why we can't just be in love, we got to be with our love. Presence is why relationship with God isn't just about knowing Him, it's about being with Him. It's why solitary confinement is the torture of the image of God, because we were meant to be with each other. But how often is it that our phones are the reason that we are around each other, but not actually with each other? You might turn off your phone an hour in the morning so that you can lead a really good conference call with your coworkers, or actually have a meeting that is worth attending. You might turn off your phone an hour in the evening so that you can actually engage your children, because we all know, especially with young children, they are so hard to hang with. They are always asking you some strange thing, like pretend this is a dragon, and that's the lava pit, and that's the couch over there, and we got to get... And if you're half in an email, you can't remember where the lava pit is. You can't figure this... But when we put them away and we spend an hour with our children undistracted, we find the beauty of they look up to us, asking their next inane question, they actually find us gazing back down at them. So maybe it's for our kids, or maybe it's just for that golden hour of silence in the evening. You know, Blaise Pascal once wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone with his thoughts. I like to wonder what would it have been like if Martin Luther King Jr. was so distracted by his phone that he never heard the voice of God in his kitchen that night, saying, "Stand up for truth, stand up for justice, and I will be with you." What love for neighbor we would have missed. So that's a practice of presence. Let me give you my last two weekly habits. First weekly habit, spend an hour in meaningful conversation with a friend every week. Now we're talking about being formed in friendship and relationship as a way of community, because so much of the rest of the world is trying to form us in solitariness, in loneliness, in individuality. It's always been true that we need friends. God made us that way. We're created in the Trinitarian image of friendship. Adam was lonely in the garden until God gave him Eve. That's why God said it's not good for you to be alone. But how much more do we need friendship? In a time and a place where we're encouraged to curate our every moment online, and yet on the other hand, lead a completely secret life. How much more do we need friends who embody the gospel? And what is the gospel? God looking at us and saying, "You are messed up, but I love you anyway." And what is a friend besides someone who sticks with you and says, "You are messed up, but I'm sticking with you anyway"? I would suggest that by cultivating the practice of friendship, we can start to embody in our culture Augustine's little command. When you walk out, go in pairs. When you get there, stay together. Last weekly habit, and to kind of end at the beginning here, Sabbath. Weekly habit of Sabbath as a formational practice is a way to look at the culture of busyness that insists that the world spins because we keep working and say, no, no, no. We can disappear. We can stop. The world will go on. We cannot answer our email. We cannot update our social media. We can get lost and somehow our office survives. Why is it? Well, because there is a sustainer of all things, and his name is Jesus. And if we were to disappear, the world will go on. But if he were to disappear, everything that we've talked about today, everything that we've lived for, everything that we've tried to piece together would snap, gone, like a cut TV signal. So we should be formed in the practice of Sabbath as a way of looking to the Creator and saying the world depends on you, not on us. So those are the habits, and let me just go back to this picture of Houston to conclude. Look in your mind, see if you can see those trucks on the road going into the storm. I began with the question, how do we be a church that walks into the storm? And I've tried to say that we're living in a climate of busyness, and that we need practices to be the kind of people who can go into that storm with love and find our neighbors there. I would encourage you, let us be like our Savior, who walks into the storm looking for those who need the light and finding them. Thank you for hearing me out.
Sorry. That was fantastic. We have time for probably 2, maybe 3 questions for Justin, if you have probably many questions, many thoughts rolling around after that. So somebody get us started and throw out a question. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
When is your book coming out?
It's the first time I've been asked that question, at least in a public setting. February of 2019. So you can read a lot about the specific practices that I'm talking about and even more on the theological underpinnings on the website. Or you can be really patient and wait till 2019, February.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What's it been like sharing this way of being with coworkers that don't know the Lord or aren't familiar with God in general?
That's a great question. How's it been sharing this way of being with coworkers who maybe don't know the Lord, right? I actually got a first opportunity, at least on a bigger scale, to do that yesterday. I got to speak at an associate's retreat in my law firm, McGuire Woods, about wellness and habits of lawyering. And it was really, really encouraging to me because I was sharing the same story I shared with you, and actually sharing the same habits, but making the argument more from an angle of why you actually need rest and healthy rhythms if you want to be an excellent worker. And so there's a counter side to this that I would call a common grace side, maybe, that is actually well documented increases of productivity, attentiveness, relationship, and collegiality in the office. So it was on the one hand exciting just to tell them, this is how to be a better lawyer. If you want to be a good lawyer, you need to learn how to rest sometimes. But it was also, I think it it was even more deeply encouraging just to share a story of how, when I was in their shoes, I was not doing well. And a few of us shared. It was some really neat, the general counsel of the firm, and then myself and some others. And we have dark stories, and it was really neat to try to introduce that air of vulnerability into the kind of, and you probably have these kind of cultures at your office where that's not the norm to talk about your problems. And so I would say it's just been encouraging to talk about this and share about this to them.
Maybe one more question.
What does it look like to swim upstream when maybe people are asking you to check your email when you're in bed?
Yeah,
or,
yeah.
What's your professional risk, or what does that felt like or look like for you?
It's a really good question. One of the things that I talked about during this panel yesterday, the biggest thing that I have found is that committing to be countercultural is first a calling, right? We're exilic people. So there's going to be a sense where we don't quite fit in where we are. And so I think the important thing is just first get comfortable with that. Fortunately, I think mostly for me this has been a practice that has kind of lit up my existence at the office. So what I was surprised about when I started turning my phone off every day from 7 to 8 p.m. to be with my kids was, one, that I got my presence back with them. And two, I was actually really surprised that nobody seemed to care that much. Like, nobody noticed I was missing. Now, there are, of course, times where I am closing a deal or on a sticky project, or I kind of know a client is going through something and they might call. And during those times, I do not turn my phone off. I probably don't even leave the office. So the thing here is the idea of there are exceptions to the habit, and then there is the habit. And I think the habit is that we need to learn how to have off times and rest. But there are exceptions, and this is where I think you actually, by flipping the habit, become a better worker, where you start to really learn the difference between an urgent email from a client that is actually a crisis that you should stay late and maybe up all night for, and the email that just hit late in the day and is just a regular, ordinary request. And what's interesting is I think we lose the ability to discern when our habit is just to do the most recent thing. So there's some great books, articles, and literature on productivity where these are actually better work habits. And so I'd say get ready to disappoint someone, but that's, how many of you don't disappoint people at work? I mean, this happens. It's a good reason to do it, but I actually think it's actually a better way to work. I hope that answers it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Justin one more time.